Chair, fellow panelists, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear students. This morning I'll be speaking to you about Sri Lanka's relations with China from 1948 up until 1995 and analyzing these 5 decades from a neoclassical realist perspective. Sri Lanka is no stranger to its relations with China, spanning from ancient relations which have been inscribed in various documents, with Fashian's visit as well as Zheng He's voyages in the 15th century. When speaking of more recent relations or contemporary relations with China, we have post-independent Sri Lanka recognizing the People's Republic of China in January 1950 alongside the British, and thereafter we also see Sri Lanka adhering to the One China policy which was prevalent at the world at that time. However, even though Sri Lanka recognized China in 1950, we did not venture on to establish formal diplomatic relations with China immediately thereafter. Which brings me to this question. Post-independent Sri Lanka fostered state-level economic ties with the People's Republic of China at a time it was not envisaged. However, once established, trade relations expanded and even influenced other areas of Sri Lanka bilateral relations. So in essence, I'm looking at why relations which commenced for economic purposes expanded. I have 2 objectives in this research. One was to analyze why Sri Lanka opted to establish unconventional relations with China, and then to examine what factors influence this. So basically understanding why 2 research questions, why Sri Lanka established economic relations, especially when the political nature and atmosphere was not conducive, and secondly to see what the domestic level factors that influence this decision and the relationship. I'm looking at all of this from a neoclassical realist perspective, which highlights the importance of domestic level variables in the formulation of a country's foreign policy. Neoclassical realism basically talks about 4 intervening domestic level variables, of which I'm only using 2. One is leader perceptions, and secondly, a state's strategic culture. The research is descriptive in nature and utilizes the case study methodology. Ladies and gentlemen, a case study can be interpreted as something that tries to illuminate a decision or a set of decisions, why they were taken, how they were implemented, and what resulted in these decisions. According to Alexander George and Andrew Bennett, a case study can also be defined as an instance of a class of events or a series of events from which the researcher chooses to investigate or examine a particular area and produce knowledge, so to come up with inferences. And it is from this background that I am looking at Sri Lanka's foreign policy with special emphasis to China, and I will now draw your attention to 3 case studies to illustrate the point, and of course due to time constraints I will not be going into a lot of detail. So ladies and gentlemen, the first case I would like to draw your attention to is the Rubberized Pact of 1952. I'm sure some of you all are aware that at this time we had 2 different ideologies in both Sri Lanka and China. One was capitalist oriented, the other was communist Marxist oriented. Sri Lanka at the time was facing a rice shortage. The domestic populace did not have food to eat, and also the main export commodity, rubber, was also not getting a really good market price in the world economy. And this is of course due to the Korean War as well as the UN embargoes on the sale of rubber. Therefore, the Sri Lankan leadership at the time decided that an agreement that is of economic in nature is beneficial for the 2 countries, whereby Sri Lanka would get the rice its domestic populace needs and be able to sell the rubber it has in excess at a very good price. And this showcases that on occasion, countries have to do what is best for their own domestic populace and do take domestic requirements into consideration when formulating its country's foreign policy. It's also indicative of a statement that Senaratne made in 1953, and I quote, "Our foreign policy will be primarily guided by the interests of the people," unquote. The second case study is the refusal by Sri Lanka to engage in economic activities with communist countries. Again, I highlight the ideological differences between Sri Lanka and China at the time, and these differences made it almost impossible for the two countries to make progress in political and also diplomatic relations. Another point is that the Sri Lankan leaders at the time were keen on maintaining the status quo. And this was also for a couple of reasons. One, and this prevented also them modernizing the country and initiating modernization programs, and also showed their reluctance to interact with the communist bloc, as it would then open out trade and other facilities, and thereby the leaders losing the authority they have. We also see there was this reluctance because the leaders, the foreign policy executive at the time, were appeasing the Western bloc. And because of this appeasement, they refused to once again establish relations with the communist bloc because they feared they would then have a reduction in relations with the West. The third and final case study I would like to present to you all is the establishment of diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and the Dominion of Ceylon in February 1957. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time we see there was a change in governance in Sri Lanka. The party that came into power was more inclined or open to having establishing relations with communist countries, and also the leader at the time, Premier S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike himself, was open to establishing relations, and his mindset was also open to communism and having friendly relations with all countries. We also see the personal ties between Premier Bandaranaike and Premier Zhou Enlai also playing a very important role in the establishment of this bilateral relations and the formal diplomatic relations. So in conclusion, Neoclassical Realist view, we talk of the importance of the influence of state leaders and their political ideology. So basically how the foreign policy executive influences a country's foreign policy decision making, as well as the expansion of relations with other countries. And this was very clearly seen not just in these case studies, but I think also of the other case studies which you will be able to read in the full paper when it's published. And we also see in the Sri Lankan context that some of the domestic realities also enable Sri Lanka to have or engage in relations with China, and of course some of these relations were beneficial for the country, therefore they went and initiated this. So all in all, I think these three case studies mentioned justifies the undertaking of a research analysis of Sri Lanka's relations from a neoclassical realist perspective, as the nature of the domestic regimes and the leader perceptions have clearly influenced the outcome of the island's foreign policy making. So in essence, the research achieves the objectives initially stated on the leader perceptions and the domestic realities, and it can be established that the era from 1948 to 1955 was influenced by the perceptions maintained by the head of government and the foreign policy executive, as well as the country's strategic culture. Thank you very much, and I'll flash some of the references that were also used during the research. Thank you.